So in this first episode, I'm really excited, very honored to welcome my new favorite friend, Tracie Jae. And Tracie and I are connected by maybe 1 or 2 degrees of separation, but haven't connected until now, and I'm honestly really glad for it. I can't wait to talk with her and soak up the wisdom and let her tell me all of the things I need to hear, because she is the quiet rebel. So Tracie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Hi. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to give our listeners here a little bit more information about you and this beautiful biography you gave me. So y'all, her work in the world is creating incremental and organic shifts to the status quo using conversations as instruments of change. Whether working with individuals, communities, or organizations, she creates space to ensure that voices are heard and thoughts are respected. Her proprietary frameworks include 100 Voices, Guided Conversations, and Human-Centered Equity. As often as possible, she incorporates silence in her work to offer participants opportunities to seek their own truths. Tracie holds a BA in Business Management and an MA in Strategic Communication and Leadership. And what I appreciate about her is the commitment to service that spans over two decades of volunteerism and vocation in Houston's nonprofit sector, including 5 years of education. She is currently serving as the regional representative for the Labyrinth Society and is active on the League of Women Voters Marketing Committee. And what's really important to me is with all of that, she has successfully launched 3 daughters into adulthood, which upon our first conversation, I had to know how she did it because, y'all, this is a major concern for my life. So, I know you love hot coffee. I know you love recharging, recharging so you can slay new dragons. But the last time we spoke, I forgot to ask you a very critical question that's been rattling in my brain.
Yes.
You ready?
I'm ready.
Tell me about bubble meditation.
Woo, okay. What I have bubbles with me. I always have, wait.
Okay. We're going to learn something new. She's getting like bubbles.
Actual bubbles.
Actual bubbles. Okay.
Yes. So, I blow bubbles as my way of remembering to breathe.
Okay.
And also to clear things out of my chest. And as a way to visually watch things leave me. So I always have bubbles handy somewhere.
Okay.
Oh, come on. That won't blow. Come on. It's because, don't be shy. We're amongst friends. It's fine. There we go.
There we go. Wow.
Yeah. So, in the before times, when it was okay to blow your air on people, I was teaching bubble meditation classes. Mm-hmm. But, now COVID and people are kind of squeamish about where your air droplets fall.
Right.
So I don't do that anymore. But I do share it as a technique with pretty much every human I encounter because it's been so helpful for me.
So quickly, if you can, just walk us through the process of. So is there like a start, middle, and end, or how does that?
There can be a start, middle, and end.
Okay.
But really, it is inhale deeply, hold until you can't, and let it go, and watch the bubbles and watch the things float away.
Wow. Okay. And you can even, like in my mind, I'm already going visual. Like I could put things in the bubbles.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. So it's a visual representation, really a breath prayer.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. Thank you. I'm so excited. I'm so glad I asked. All right. We're going to teach our kids that when we start meeting back in person.
Absolutely.
So, yay. I'm just, learning about you through our mutual friends, as well as internet stalking you, which I told you before I did. I'm just, like I said, part of me wishes we'd connected sooner, but I'm glad that we didn't, because I think this is the most appropriate time, the most appropriate season for us to be talking. I don't know if I would have been able to really absorb everything that I can learn from you, but I really am impressed with, from our last conversation, your perspective on what the church can and should do to facilitate better, more helpful, more productive conversation. And while we covered some of that in season 1, because we talked a lot about bias, what I really find is you're creating space, you're opening doors for people to actually have those conversations. But before we really get into the meat of what I want to talk about today, I want to hear more about how you arrived at this place. So, just lay it all out. No, whatever you're comfortable with sharing.
I mean, that's a tiny question, Amy.
Right, I know.
Like, how I arrived at this place. There's so many avenues, actually, to this spot.
Yeah.
Right? And in truth, a friend recently helped me draw like a mind map that started with one central point. We chose 100 Voices as sort of the launching of this spider map. But the way I describe it is there's a lot of connected dots in my life.
Yeah.
Many of which I'm able to see, and I'm really grateful that I'm able to see them. But some of them are still being revealed, right? There are people, places, things in my life from decades now ago that are showing up to be significant today. And I'm just really grateful that God doesn't waste anything.
Yeah.
So that's the sort of abbreviated answer,
right?
to your
abbreviated is
to your question. Yeah,
it's good. That's a good place to start. So, I guess along with that, and I'm assuming this mind map is this idea of how you arrived where you are. And what you say is so interesting because we always start out with our own paths that we think we're going to be journeying. And I remember doing a certain type of prayer one time, and I got this visual in my head of, how you have all these routes on, well, I'm going to date myself because I just thought MapQuest, but you have all these routes and
I'm right there with you.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you can go on different ones and click on different ones. Now we're in the present in Google Maps. But so in my mind, I was seeing where all these other paths were dark, that they existed, but the only one that was truly lit was the path that God was leading me on. And it was only lit up to one next step in advance. So I love that idea of the mind map. And I have a feeling that that's what brought you to this work of creating transformative conversations. So tell us how maybe one of the frameworks, whether it was 100 Voices or the human-centered equity.
Human-centered equity.
Human-centered equity. Thank you. So how did you get there to create those?
So the short answer, and I'll expand a little bit, but the short answer is I follow Spirit. I trust Spirit. I should also qualify this and say that I am not religious, that I have been religious in my life, that my personal faith journey is winding and varied. But I don't consider myself currently a religious person. Okay. But I trust Spirit, period, full stop. And when I receive something that feels like an instruction, I try not to hesitate without doing something active toward that instruction. Yeah. And both of these things, 100 Voices and human-centered equity, came to me as instruction.
Wow. So in the charismatic world, we would call that a download.
Yes.
But I hate that term.
Yes, I've received a download. Yes, I'm familiar with that term.
Right.
Yes.
God bless our evangelical brothers and sisters, charismatic. They're awesome. But we are also at a place in our church where the idea of, we adhere to the Christian tradition, but following Spirit is really following the Spirit of Jesus, if you will. That's really where we're driving people.
Okay, so I don't want to derail our conversation too far. However, when I hear people say things like, we follow what you just said, we follow Jesus and to the Spirit, or the Spirit to Jesus, or the whatever, separating Jesus and Spirit. Right. Which, again, I've got this varied ecumenical path, so I speak a lot of religious language. And part of what sticks out to me from Christian tradition, but I don't think is often communicated, is Holy Spirit is Christian. Yeah. Right? It's not separate and apart from Jesus the Christ who walked the earth, right? It is the thing that Jesus the Christ left behind so we would all have access to it.
Right.
And so oftentimes I think that in Christian settings, we get really fixated with Christ who walked.
Yeah.
And we want to put a lot of energy in the Christ that walked.
Right.
Which is, I'm not knocking it.
Right.
It's a great example to live by.
Right.
Right? But the Christ who walked left and said, I'm leaving this thing that you have access to, that everybody's got. Mm-hmm. Follow it. Right. Trust it.
Right.
But then we don't. We think that's weird or hokey or somehow not Christian.
Right. Right.
So then I'm confused.
Right. Right. Well, and too, in our human nature, especially our religious human nature, we got to put boxes around things. We got to understand, because our minds can't fathom the enormity of the Spirit hovered over the waters of chaos and brought order and goodness out of it. And so, we've got to put boundaries around it.
I know, and I think religion in its most delicious sense leads to relationship. Yeah. And I think if religion is not leading to relationship, then it is not doing an adequate job. Yeah. I think it should be the job of religion to put itself out of business. And that eventually each person has their own relationship with divinity, whatever that looks like. Right. But, job security is a thing.
It is, and humans only have so long to live.
This is true.
It's for me, it's this idea of you have to get God out of the box. Yes, that's a very well-worn truism, but I think where people get tricky and uncomfortable, and truthfully, secretly, that's what this whole podcast is about, is just breaking down some of those boundaries that we've created, because a lot of them are just harmful, whether they're harmful at a personal level, whether they're harmful at a societal level, a generational level even. Goodness. I was having a conversation with one of our members earlier today, and she's going through a 2-year cancer journey, and she said, I'm just, she got some mixed results in her last scan, and she said, I'm just wondering, I've got to be more faithful. I've got to be more consistent so this healing will come through. And I was like, wait a minute, time out. You think God is withholding healing because you're not holding up your end of the bargain? And she was like, oh, that's a good question. I mean, to even broach the subject that you're good enough. It's really radical for people, but it's a huge movement right now in the church. Underground. And I see you're like, we're just going to go on a tangent.
Bubbles. I got to blow bubbles. Tiny bubbles.
Start naming those bubbles right now. But that led you, Spirit led you to this work that you do. Yeah. These transformative places and spaces of conversation. Yeah. Because, I mean, you can't have justice unless you talk about it.
Absolutely not.
So tell me what somebody would expect in a 100 Voices. Are they called seminars or?
I don't know what to call it. I don't like boxes, so I don't do well with labels. Right. Let's go with workshop. Okay. That just seems like a term other people might understand. Workshop. Right. So 100 Voices is a guided conversation. Okay. Based on lived experience. Okay. And it's an opportunity to hear the world through someone else's lens, and also for you to hear the world through your own lens. Because that's the part I think sometimes we miss, right? Yep. I know when the world cracked open, when George Floyd was murdered and the world cracked open, lots of people went on a learning journey and decided they wanted to read all the things that were out there. And,
I'm raising my hand in case you're just listening. I had to, but
whatever. We start somewhere.
Yes.
Right. And for a lot of people, that was where they started. Like, I'm going to get all the books. I'm going to read all the things.
Well, I have a problem with books anyway, but
that's okay. Me too. Books. I got so many books. But they didn't, in large part, explore themselves or how they arrived at where they are.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And the questions that I ask in a 100 Voices workshop are, I don't think they're invasive questions. They're just things we don't always talk about. Right? For instance, when were you first aware of people outside of your cultural background?
I'm thinking. It was much later than I think I want to admit. Yeah.
And
on a regular basis. Yeah. High school, I think. Yeah.
And so if you're in a space where people are non-homogeneous, what is the opposite of homogeneous? Heterogeneous, heterogeneous, whatever, however you say those words.
Right.
Often what happens is people aren't aware that they've never been aware.
Yeah.
And if you live in a community where everybody looks like you, where everybody, for the most part, acts like you, comes from the same whatever, socioeconomic background, yada, yada, then you don't even have to necessarily consider who else exists in the world.
Right.
And oftentimes we don't.
Right.
Even in communities that would be looked at as underserved or underprivileged, if these are the only people you ever see, this is the only life you've ever been exposed to, then you think the world looks a particular way. Wow. Now, what has happened and what continues to happen in America is, though, the dominant culture is forced upon people everywhere we go.
Right.
Right. And so if we want to do anything that looks like success
right.
in America, the way that it is currently formulated, then you have to get to know people and get to live in a way that is acceptable to dominant culture.
Right.
But people who grow up in dominant culture don't have that as a pressure.
Yeah.
And if you don't have that as a pressure, why would you just take it on?
Right.
Right?
Right.
Why should I just make myself uncomfortable if I've been comfortable my whole life?
Comfort is, I think, Richard Rohr says, certainty is the enemy of faith, but I don't know, comfort's right up there too, maybe number 2, enemy of faith. It is, nothing changes.
Yeah.
Nothing changes in a system that already works.
Yeah.
So.
And the other thing that I think, if at no other time in our history 2020 has proven, is that we confuse comfort with safety. Because I'm making you uncomfortable, that is not the same as making you unsafe.
Right. Right.
Right? Yeah. And so just because you're hearing some things you maybe never heard before, you're hearing them in a way you've never heard them before, or you're having to face some parts of yourself that you don't really want to deal with,
right.
That's discomfort. And so what? You're uncomfortable,
right.
But you are not unsafe. But there are many people living in bodies where they are unsafe.
Right.
And it's also uncomfortable.
Right. Well, it's traumatic.
Honey, we don't even get me started on trauma. That's a whole other conversation.
Well, yes, I'm writing down invite
side note asterisk
for trauma conversation.
Yeah, we can talk about trauma some other time, because that's a whole other rabbit hole.
It is, and there's some really narrow definitions of trauma, but everybody uses it. My Gen Z daughters use trauma, like cool. Like that's the new word for cool is trauma.
Yeah, but again, that's because our discomfort has been labeled as unsafe.
Right.
And so if you're told that whenever you're uncomfortable, you're also unsafe,
right.
Then everything feels like trauma.
Right.
It's not.
It's not. It's not, Gen Z people. It's not.
It's not.
So how many times do you have to repeat this in a workshop? Is there planned times where you remind people, like, how do you get people over their freak outs?
So I began all my work with Inhumans with agreements. Mm-hmm. And the first agreement always in whatever work I'm doing, no matter what it looks like, is love first always. And love is an acronym. Okay. Listen with your heart. Observe your own biases, venture into unfamiliar territory, expect the best. So I also add to that, this is meant to be, whatever space I'm in is meant to be both safe and brave. Mm-hmm. And let's don't confuse safety and comfort.
Right.
And when you're feeling uncomfortable, the invitation is to be brave.
Mm. That's good.
And so,
because I think so much right now is, especially with, on social media, quite a few of the activists I follow too, they're okay with making you uncomfortable. Like, they just want to be in your face, but it's that piece, that invitation, which I know you said last time we talked, invitation was your love language, but that invitation to be brave is, and we can segue into what we're here to talk about, but that to me is what the church should do best, is create spaces where people can be safe and brave, but yet we've created so many spaces where we don't do things that way, we don't talk about things that way, we don't talk about religion and politics in church. It's just, not that I'm not preaching on politics anytime soon. No, thank you. But so how do we?
Well, just to like put a little whatever in there.
Yeah.
We live under this false assumption that there's a separation between church and state. But that's a fallacy.
Yeah.
And we expect people to come to power, bringing some faith tradition with them.
That's right.
However, it must be an acceptable faith tradition. And we assume that those values that are attached to the faith tradition that they're bringing are widely acceptable and are the ones we should always follow.
And that they will follow.
Right. And when we also bring the restriction of religion into our social world.
Yeah.
And then we try to impose our thoughts, feelings, and beliefs on other people, as opposed to honoring the freedoms that we say we have here.
Right.
Then it creates a whole other situation.
Right. So there's just layer and layer and layer and layer and layer. There's a lot of layers.
There's a lot of layers.
And we don't even start to tap into those layers until we have a conversation.
Absolutely.
Wow. So how long do your workshops last?
Typically 2 hours.
Okay.
When I do them for corporate folks, I tend to abbreviate them because 2 hours just feels like a lot.
Yeah.
However, what has always happened 100% of the time, regardless if we abbreviate it or we don't, people at the end say, we didn't have enough time.
Right.
100% of the time, people say, we didn't have enough time. We've been here for 2 hours, y'all.
Yeah.
I don't care. We need more time.
Right. So is the goal to turn that light on?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so then send them out to do the work they need to do.
Yeah. And that was early on when I did the very first 100 Voices event, which was a face-to-face event here in Houston. I didn't have a plan for it. Again, I was just trusting spirit, right? Like, I got this instruction. I was like, okay, here we go. Yeah. And if it works, maybe we'll do this annually. Like, let's see. Let's just see what happens. Yeah. If we bring together 100 strangers in a room and talk about race and culture, let's just see.
Yeah.
And that first event was only women. We were at 100, 10 tables of 10, women from all backgrounds and socioeconomics and all the things. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Beautiful. And at the end of that very first one, they said, we need more time. And then the next thing was, okay, what do we do now? hadn't thought that far. I don't know.
Right. You're like, I was just doing this.
Right. Like I didn't get all of that in my download. I don't know. It's just,
and you won't ever, by the way.
Yeah.
Never get
Right.
all the pieces.
But what happened after that, I could not have imagined in all my life. A friend in Seattle took note of this, and asked me if I would be willing to come to Seattle and replicate it. And I was like, okay.
Yeah.
Let's go to Seattle.
Yeah.
Right. And then the world shut down.
Right.
So I couldn't go to Seattle, and the two of us, put our heads together virtually and said, okay, how can we still pull this off? So we decided we would do it virtually. And we could, use Zoom and do breakout rooms and still have the idea of 10 small groups, and bring in women from Seattle and have that conversation. And in the process of our planning, which was supposed to be for the summer of 2020, then George Floyd was murdered and the world cracked open, and suddenly this thing that was just given to me as an instruction became sort of essential work. And there were lots of people saying, okay, we need to talk. How do we talk? Right. I don't know. How does my mouth work? Like, what does that look like? Right. And so we started getting invitations from lots of places to have this conversation. Yeah. And then Megan is my friend in Seattle, who was at the time working on her PhD, asked if she could revisit the topic of her PhD and write about the effectiveness of 100 voices. And so she did. And now she's Dr. Megan.
Yeah. Wow.
Writing about some work that came to me as an instruction. Yeah. And I get to have this conversation with people all over the country and really, in fact, all over the world, because some of the organizations I've worked with have been global. And so, I trust spirit, right? I follow spirit. Yeah. And if you had told me 2 years ago or even a year ago that thing that came to me in my sleep and woke me up would turn into this, I would have just thought, whatever, y'all are crazy.
Right. So are you as busy as you want to be right now?
I'm differently busy because I've gotten new instructions, and although I love 100 Voices and I love creating that space for people to have conversations, having those conversations has led me to human-centered equity, which is so often what I hear in the conversations, besides the fact that people don't really have a chance or take the time to look at themselves and see how they wound up in this place, from an organizational standpoint, no matter really what kind of organization it is, public, private, for-profit, nonprofit, those organizations are made up of humans. Right. And there's a lot of work in this air quotes DEI space, diversity, equity, inclusion. Yeah. And then the diversity, equity, and inclusion has also added some alphabets. So there's sometimes a J for justice, sometimes a B for belonging, sometimes an A for access, sometimes any alphabet soup of those letters. Right. Wow. When the idea is to bring all the humans into a space that is welcoming and accepting. Mm-hmm. But we can't do that if we're focusing on creating a little tiny space for humans that are not like us.
A pocket.
A little pocket,
pocket space.
Yeah,
pocket square.
We've been taking up all this space with just us, and now I'm gonna make a little hole in the space for somebody else. Right. And when they come, we're gonna start off by celebrating how different they are, and put them on the spot for their difference.
Right.
But then we're going to expect them to act like us.
Right. Right. That's the unspoken rule.
Yes. When you get here, because you're different,
Yeah.
you got to change
Right.
to fit.
So we can all be comfortable again.
So we can all be comfortable again.
Together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I take exception to the way that we live into this idea that we're putting out.
Yeah.
And so I, again, am following spirit, and also because I love an acronym. HUMAN is also an acronym.
Yeah.
And it is honest, urgent, meaningful, accountable, and nuanced. And rather than approaching this dynamic of who we're inviting into our perfect little space that we've already created,
Yeah.
it is an attempt to approach how we invite.
Yeah. Okay. So it sounds to me like it's the next step beyond the initial workshop to say, okay, here I am imagining and viewing myself. I am now aware that there are other people in the world who operate differently and who think differently. Okay, so now what do I do from there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if we can think for a second in a sort of historical context, newsflash for anybody that's not familiar with this concept, America was built on free labor, also known as enslavement.
And that's where the word human capital comes from.
It's where human capital comes from, and also a lot of our human resource practices and how we govern production and lots of things.
Yeah.
Production and productivity.
Yeah.
And at the end of that time period, when people were told that they were no longer captives, there was no instruction. Not to either side of this equation.
Right.
And so you have people who were just released
Yeah.
into the ether
Right.
to just make do,
Yeah.
right? So there's one part of this equation that's never been worked out. Not ever, not one time. Also, at that same time, there was no instruction given to either side of this equation about how we're supposed to interact now,
Right.
right? Because if you've
That's
got
good.
one group of folks who've always been in charge and always thought of the other group of people as less than people, and one group of people who have, for their entire existence on this continent, been thought of as less than human and have been treated as less than human and have never had the same rights, privileges, and access as other humans,
Yeah.
then what do you do with that?
Right.
Which, again, we've never done.
Right.
Instead, what we've done is the same thing that we're trying to do with the air quotes again DEI world, is make a space for people to fit in a space that they've never fit in.
Yeah.
And somehow make it feel like that's better.
Right.
Why is it better?
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
we did the same thing with segregation, right? So we get out of this, post-Civil War era, Reconstruction, yada, yada. We move into the whole like Jim Crow situation, and all those same mentalities still exist,
Right.
right? All of the same societal rules still exist.
Right.
And now we're going to force integration,
Right.
right? Which, as a concept, seems like it makes sense because all the things that this dominant culture has seems better,
Yeah.
right? It's prettier, it's shinier, it's got all the bells and whistles,
Right.
and we've been excluding this group of people from it. So the fair thing to do
Yeah.
is to let them in.
Right.
But while the dominant culture was over here doing all the things and keeping people away and saying, no, you can't come over here, the non-dominant culture was creating stuff for themselves.
Yeah.
I was about to curse because that's how I talk. Was creating stuff for themselves.
Yeah.
And had a perfectly fine world.
Yep.
With access and money and success and all the things.
Yeah.
But then you won't, now you want me to go over there? In fact, you're going to force me to go over there.
Right.
Because that's the rule.
Right.
Right? And at the same time as you're forcing me to go over there, you're forcing them to accept me over there.
Right.
So we're doing all this work by force.
Yep.
But none of it with love.
Yeah.
None of it with trust. None of it with building up the internal structure of humans.
Right.
And you can't legislate love.
No.
And you can't legislate humanity.
Right.
But you have to equip people to be able to coexist peacefully. Yeah. If we don't give people the tools, or as Resma Menakem would say, the toys, to coexist peacefully, then what are we doing?
Right. Two arching thoughts here. We are moving headlong 18 years away from white people no longer being the majority in this country. Is that
physically?
Physically, right. And at the same time, and maybe it's because who I follow on social media and what I care about, it seems like the activists that have been working in this space, people of color, because white people haven't really needed to or wanted to or even paid attention to, they're mushrooming. Their access, their platforms are mushrooming. But in your opinion, how much inroad is there being made right now? Because I know my perception is, and it's because of the waters that I swim in, it looks great. But then I go into other spaces and I'm like, wait, what?
So whiteness is not about skin.
Yeah.
Whiteness is a construct, right? As is blackness. They were both a created thing.
Right.
Right? And the system of whiteness is still got a stronghold. Doesn't really matter what the people look like.
Right.
If the system of whiteness is still the dominant culture,
right,
regardless of what the humans look like that inhabit that whiteness,
right,
then we got a little ways left to go beyond 18 years.
Absolutely. Right. Well, it
and
took us a couple centuries to get here.
Absolutely. And the thing that whiteness has become good at is recruiting whiteness.
Yeah.
Right? So people who are thought of as white today may not have always fallen into that category.
Right.
And the fewer and fewer humans that look the part, the more the arms reach out to recruit people who didn't always fit that description. And so we notice in our census and in our everyday life that there's this sort of undercurrent of recruiting people who used to be considered brown over into whiteness.
Right. Right. That's how you get access, right? That's how you get privilege.
It's absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. And so the clarity around who gets to wear that badge has always existed in this country, whether it was immediately extended or not.
Right. Right.
And because we actively seek to be in a place where we're better than someone, it's very easy to point the finger at the people who don't look like us and say, well, at least I'm better than them.
Right. So is it going to become more of a behavioral model?
It has already become the behavioral model. It is the behavioral model.
So it's going to be less about what you look like and more about how you act.
Yeah.
Whew.
And since people who are labeled as Black in America are the only group of people who were legislated into a group.
Yeah.
and labeled as such, and that we inherited this mark, right? That is still the only group of people who, I'm going to say, actively have to fight for the right to be part of the dominant culture.
Okay.
Even though the dominant culture is sucky.
Yeah.
It sucks.
Yeah.
Not
It's
not
based
that
on
not,
debasing, devaluing humanity.
yeah.
Your inherent goodness.
And I want to make sure that I'm clear when I say that, and I'm very cautious about the words that I choose, because I don't want anybody to walk away from this conversation thinking that I think that white people are inherently bad,
Right.
or that Tracie Jae does not like white people. Tracie Jae does not like whiteness. I do not like that system.
Yeah.
I do not like how it was manufactured. I don't like how it's lived into.
Yeah.
Which is very different from not liking white people.
Yeah. Well, and I just keep coming back to it hurts everybody.
Absolutely.
It's just because I, as a white woman, have been born into this privilege, and it still debases and degrades who I am as a human to live in a system that debases and degrades other humans.
Yeah.
It's violence. Yeah. And it's force. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So how do we change it?
How do we fix it?
Right, because that's what everybody wants to do. We fix it.
Yeah.
But really, honestly, my question is, how do I continue to have conversations with my children? How do I continue to facilitate the conversation to bring, because if you don't ever bring it to light,
Yeah.
I mean, then we're back in, to use a faith-based metaphor, we're back in the garden and we're using fig leaves. It's just, maybe they're not fig leaves anymore, they're oak leaves or they're palm branches, or it's back to a system of we're operating in the dark.
Yeah.
Purposefully, willingly. I just made that up right here. I'm going to use it.
I like it.
But so my main spheres of influence are the church that I work in, and whatever churches invite me to do any work, and my family. So how do I teach my 3 girls? How do I keep them? We even had a conversation last night about it with my 15-year-old, because she's an Enneagram 5. She has to know all the things.
Okay.
But let me just ask the question: How do no, we can't fix it? I think it's struggling with my words here. It's not going to be changed overnight, but it's almost like we have to. There's not a reformation that has to happen. There's a whole new system that has to be built up alongside of it. As this one comes down, you have to build up something else.
Yeah. So there's no short answer to your question.
Right.
One of my least favorite expressions is because we've always done it this way. I absolutely detest that statement. But it is the way we operate here.
Yeah.
Why do we need to change it? That's how we've always done it.
Right.
But the way we've always done it hasn't been equitable. It hasn't welcomed all people into the fabric of our society in the way that we proclaim we want to.
Right.
And at the same time as I have this disdain for that statement, I also believe if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Right? So there are some things about the structure of our country that have helped it sustain itself for this long.
Yeah.
Even though it's still really an infant in the terms of countries.
100%.
Right?
Yeah.
But there are some things about the way the system is created that work.
Yeah.
Right? So I am not from the school of thought that says, scrap the whole thing and start over.
Right.
Right? But I am from the school of thought that says, examine every part carefully. Right? It's kind of the Marie Kondo of government.
Yeah.
Right? We're going to take it all out.
Yeah.
We're going to put it all in front of us.
Right.
And we're going to pick up the parts, everything, and say, do I love this?
Yeah.
Right? Is it serving me still?
Yeah.
And if it's not, then I'm going to bless it on its way. And I'm going to either replace it or I'm going to just let it go.
Right.
Right? Yeah. Does it still work? Does it still serve us?
Yeah.
Do we love the way it makes us feel?
Right.
Right? Marie Kondo. And I would venture to guess that the majority of us would look at many things in our current system and say, oh no, that's no, that's gotta go. Yeah. That's not really working. Right. Right? Or it hasn't worked in a long time and we thought we could fix it, but it's not fixable.
Right.
Right? Yeah. But we're afraid. And we make a lot of decisions based on fear rather than making decisions based on love.
Right.
And as long as we continue to make fear-based decisions, we're going to stay where we are.
Yeah.
And going back to the conversation about religion and politics, we use that fear to move people in either direction.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
There's also this common misconception that I'm a Democrat.
Me too, by the way.
You know, I choose not to support any particular party because I don't think either of them is doing a particularly great job.
Me too. Yes, tracking.
Right? So I struggle at every election.
Yep.
Right? And also, it is the system that we have, and it's the system that it has so far worked for us maintaining some sort of order in the way we live.
Right.
Right? And so I vote. So I advocate for voters. I advocate for voting.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I think all of those things are necessary and important in a country where we consider it a democracy.
Yeah.
But I think there's a lot of things about that system that suck.
Right.
Right? So, having said all of that, how do we fix it? We start with ourselves because a lot of what we do in this country is point fingers.
Yeah.
It's real easy to look at what they're doing and say, those people should not be doing that.
Right.
But
That's bad.
But what about me?
Right.
What have I done? How have I contributed to the way things are, and what can I do differently?
Yeah.
I think that's where we start. And then I'll just redirect us back to being human, starting with humans, having a human-centered focus, and back to the acronym HUMAN. Are we having honest conversations? Are we acting in urgency? Which is different from like speed.
Right.
Right. I don't want us to be doing things quickly for the sake of doing them quickly.
Right.
Right. Urgency is internal.
Right.
It is intrinsically motivated. Right. I feel like this is important, and so I'm moving in that direction intentionally. Right. That's urgency.
Yeah.
Is it meaningful? Right. We're not just checking things off a list. We're not just being performative. Right. Is it actually making a difference in someone's life?
Right.
Is it meaningful?
Right.
Is it accountable? When we don't do the things we said we were going to do, is there some accountability?
Right.
Right. For ourselves and for other people around us.
Right.
And is it nuanced? Is it taking into account the lived experience of the people we are trying to serve?
Yeah.
All of the people, not some of the people.
Right.
And if it is not taking into account the lived experience of all the people we are trying to serve, then we have to make some adjustments.
Yeah. So how can a church shift from, I'm not calling anybody out here, but shift from a mindset of, and it's a both and, truthfully, it's not an either or. I'm super done with binary systems, but how would a church go from serving the underserved in their community, providing necessary survival items and food, to becoming a church that also has those people in its midst? Like, because that's where I feel like, especially in the Methodist Church too, where we are, we're serving, we're serving the community, we're serving the poor, we're helping the orphan, we're meeting the needs of the widow. Check, check, check. You know, that goats and sheep conversation will go real well. But to me, there's a broader vision, and that's why I wanted to do this series, is because there's a broader vision of that's still promoting an us and them mentality. So how would a church begin to move from us and them, even though we're serving and doing good work, to a human-centered model?
So the answer that the church doesn't want to hear is the church has to own the part it played in creating the people that they're serving. If there were not poor people, if there were not hungry people, if there were not, well, widows is not something we can necessarily control because people die. But if the systems that support our nation and also our churches did not create such division already, and would advocate for social services and systems that actually build humans instead of control humans, then I think that's where we have to start. Right? As long as we're like, but we're doing good work and we're helping all these people, but you know you created some of these people. Right. You actively support systems that create circumstances where people cannot do better for themselves. And then rely on the churches and the whoever else with what looks like a handout. But if people had all the things that they needed to just live sufficient lives in the first place, there would be a lot less handing out that had to happen.
It's the difference between an abundant mindset and a scarcity mindset. And that is a whole other that's just a whole podcast.
That's a whole podcast, and it could go right there with the trauma podcast, because those two things are connected.
Not just an episode, it is a whole thing. Whole thing. And you know, well, we're gonna put a pin in that. We're gonna come back to scarcity another time.
What the Applying Jesus people don't know yet is that I'm gonna be the only guest this whole season, and I'm gonna just keep coming back talking about all the things. No one else is coming. It's just gonna be me and Amy unpacking all the things.
And that would be fine. That would be fine with me. I'll go ahead and send those emails this afternoon. Sorry, y'all. You got bumped. Oh, no. Oh, my goodness. One thing that you said in the first conversation we had, so step one is own for the church. But that quickly leads into step two, which is lament. And there's no better resource for lament than the Psalms. I'm in the Psalms right now. But we don't want to lament. I remember probably about 6 or 7 years ago, we did a whole Lent series on lament, and I was so tired of being sad. By the fifth Sunday, I just could not deal with being sad anymore. But it's necessary. And grief is a never-ending process.
It's a part of the process, and it goes back to comfort. Right, which we talked about earlier. And we don't want to lament because it's uncomfortable. Right.
Well, white people don't.
No.
People of color.
People.
But I would say people of color have more experience with lament.
I would say that's probably true. But also, we don't want it.
Right.
Just because it's familiar.
Forced.
Doesn't mean that we want it.
Right.
Sure, I can get to lament real fast. Because I've got a lived experience that's attached to lament, right? That don't mean I want to lament. I would much rather, like, I have a hashtag that I live by, which is feed the happy, right? Like, I want to be happy. Amy, period. right? I'm not interested in lamenting, but I also recognize it as a very real part of my life.
Yeah.
And I recognize that on the other side of my lament is a lot of joy, right? But if I ignore the sadness, if I ignore my trauma, if I ignore the grief, if I just keep stuffing it down, then I'm not only probably hurting people around me, but I'm certainly hurting myself.
Right. Yep. Because it is going to come out.
It absolutely comes out as sweat.
Yeah.
It is sweat. It's going to come out of your pores all over everything. I'm pretty sure everything's going to be wet and funky.
I appreciate that visual. Thank you. Oh, man. That's why you got to lament, y'all. Don't sweat it on other people.
Yeah, walking around sweaty and funky, and that's just not what we want.
Yes. Oh, man. Well, I think I'm going to end on that note. Sweat. But it is true. Churches want to know. People want to know how they get engaged with this work, because it's not enough to just have activists having more access and having a bigger platform. That's not why they got in the work in the first place. So to me, because I live in this world, it should start at the church. This should be the place of healing. This should be not even the hospital. This should be the rehab center. So last question. Who do you follow? Who would you encourage? And remember, you're speaking to a multicultural audience too.
Yeah.
It's not just me and my mom who's going to listen to this. Who would you point them to follow? Who would you, and not just about for learning, but just that continued exposure?
So that's a big question, because it depends really on where you want to start.
Right.
I will say for my own learning journey, because I also grew up in America and learned the same stuff that everybody else learned, except that I've had the value of having lived through some things that also added to my learning. But the most impactful book I read in 2020 was Cast by Isabel Wilkerson.
Ooh, that actually gave me some nightmares. Ooh.
And what I love about that book is that Isabel Wilkerson is a trained journalist, and she writes the book through a very matter-of-fact lens.
Yes.
Right? Here's the history, period.
Yeah.
Right? It's not colored in any with emotion or any of those things. It is just, here's how we got to be here.
Right.
It's a scarily accurate timeline of American history.
Yeah.
There are some other books that I'm also reading, or have read. Sonia Renee Taylor's The Body Is Not an Apology. I would absolutely say follow her, read her work. Adrienne Marie Brown has really great work. Bell Hooks, who we recently lost, has really poignant thoughts about humanity and love in her work. There's a compilation book called 400 Years.
I've heard of that one.
Which will introduce you to a lot of writers, thought leaders. And Dr. Clint Smith. There's a lot of people coming to mind right now, but Dr. Clint Smith, his book is The Way the Word Was Passed. And it talks about sort of historical relics and how we rewrite history for the point of the successor.
Yeah.
And even sometimes not. Right? Like the whole affection we have for the Civil War and all the people who fought on the losing team.
Right.
But that we still hold in such high esteem in our country.
Right. And where can people find you?
Where can people find me? I'm Googleable as they say. Tracie with an I-E, J-A-E is how you spell my name properly. Oftentimes people misspell it, even though my full name is in most of my email addresses. And my company is The Quiet Rebel. And my website is quietrebellife.com. I'm also on Instagram and Facebook, mostly on Instagram, also on Twitter. You can find me. I'm easy to find.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you do a podcast as well.
I do a podcast as well on Mondays called Make It Make Sense, where we talk about the things that make no sense to us.
Yeah.
And yeah.
I started listening to the one from yesterday, and it might have been not yesterday, because I don't have access to that release schedule. The latest release from last Monday. And, it was a young woman who...
Raven.
Raven, yeah. That was a sweet conversation, it sounds like.
Yeah, Raven is my non-biological daughter.
Yeah. And
one of my favorite humans.
Yeah.
And if you ever want to follow somebody who will help you with your self-help journey, with your self-love journey, Raven Alexis.
Also Googleable.
Raven with 2 E's, though. It's a little Raveen.
V-E-N. Okay.
Yeah.
It'll be in the show notes.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us here today.
I'm glad to be here.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
I appreciate you. I'm glad we met.
It is mutual.
Yes.
And and I will come back to talk about any of the things you want to talk about.
Applying Jesus is hosted and produced by Amy Vogel, Director of Spiritual Growth for Upper Room Heights. We record at Chapelwood United Methodist Church Digital Studio in Houston, Texas. We hope something you heard today has deepened your faith, opened your eyes, and led you to not only knowing God in a more expansive way, but shift how you connect, especially with those who are easy to overlook. To find out more about Amy and our church community, go to www.urheights.com. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Remember, we love you, and there's nothing you can do about it.